With the announcement and upcoming release of Far Cry New Dawn, a post-apocalyptic spin-off, now will be a good time to head in the opposite direction. For fans of primitive archery, you can't get much more primitive than Far Cry Primal. Set in the fictional European region of Oros, Primal puts players into the hide boots of Taka of the Winja people, and his journey of survival in the untamed wilds of prehistory. While Primal is entirely made up, it's worth noting with some fascination how little we retain of true primitive archery. Archery predates recorded history, and we know of archery being used from cave paintings. However, as bows were made from organic materials, nearly every specimen has been lost to time. Fragments of arrowheads and bows have been dated to well over 10,000 years ago. Primal doesn't exactly present us with a realistic or historically accurate take on primitive archery, but it's not a huge suspense of disbelief. This is, after all, a world where the developers have created their own language, and our protagonist rides a saber-toothed tiger. So join me in my journey through the primitive lands of Oros from the view of a modern-day archer. While bows have been in the Far Cry series since Far Cry 3 as an optional stealth weapon, in Primal, bows are the primary weapon. Of course, you have clubs and spears, all of which can be thrown, and spears especially do significant damage. Bows are, however, the first weapon you obtain, with several different types of bows for different purposes, and generally being the most versatile weapon set. Not only does this make archery fans happy, the primitive setting really makes this fascinating. As a first-person shooter, Primal adopts Far Cry's smooth gunplay, without the guns. All bows can shoot from the hip, if you can call it that, with the widening reticle representing the spread that we are more familiar with in gun-based shooters. Aiming replaces this with a single dot, which is nearly pinpoint accurate. While a far cry from realism compared to more immersive games like Kingdom Come Deliverance, this simple method facilitates faster engagements. In fact, the archery is so smooth, the bow is probably going to be your go-to weapon unless you really need to smack someone with a club or bring down a wild animal with a spear. Ammunition is plentiful, either being found on fallen enemies or crafted with basic materials, the latter option being significantly easier with some skill upgrades multiplying the number of arrows crafted. This faith in the good old stick and string is shared by your allies and adversaries. Most fights take place in mid-range, with most fighters being armed with bows or javelins and skirmishing with each other. As the human player, you have much more mobility and better reaction, taking control of the situation with more robust tactics. The responsiveness of the controls and the frequent quick engagements is a hallmark of the Far Cry games, and Primal feels just as good. Beyond just shooting things, Taka has the ability to set these weapons on fire. This makes the most sense with arrows. While this can be used to set fires to control the environment, this is most likely going to be a utility tool to burn objectives and set signal fires. That said, the bow is going to be the weapon you use from start to finish, and integrated into the gameplay and story. There's even an amazing dream sequence in which you take the persona of a flaming warrior to literally shoot down the moon. This makes Primal one of the most dedicated archery games in the mainstream market. As an open-world game, the player is given a few basic tools and then has the option of going out into the wider world to collect materials to upgrade items. Later weapons and tools are locked behind missions. Taka's starting bow is the bow. I seriously had to look this up on Google to make sure I hadn't missed a more obvious name, but here we are. The bow is the general purpose bow, with well-rounded stats for speed and accuracy, though it's worth noting that accuracy is more or less exact with the dot is. Suited for most scenarios early in the game, the upgraded bow increases damage and speed, making it the equivalent of an assault rifle in modern Far Cry games, just with single arrows, but rapidly. attacker can then unlock a primitive longbow. This fills the role of the sniper rifle. The longbow does more damage and provides the player with a small degree of magnification for better accuracy on long distance targets. The improved long distance accuracy and power is compensated by having a much slower rate of fire. The third bow type is the double bow. The double bow shoots 2 arrows at once for double the damage. While the stats imply that it has the best speed, that seems to go to the upgraded bow rather than the double bow. Of the bow types, I found myself defaulting to the regular bow most of the time, especially after upgrading it. The longbow has some use as a long-range weapon, but most of the time you should be able to dispatch enemies with the regular bow stealthily and quickly. I found the double bow to be the least useful of the three, mostly because it doesn't do anything the other bows can't. The spread of the double shot is unfavourable compared to just filling a spear, which has the most raw damage of any ranged weapon. Now you might be wondering, how authentic is all this? There's a surprising amount of detail. Sure, spears are just pointy sticks with stone heads and clubs are big sticks or bones, but the amount of time you spend using the bow makes you think about how plausible that would be in real life. The regular bow is fairly regular. While most bows in the real world are made from a single piece of wood, Taka's bow is made from 2 pieces lashed together with leather strips to create what will be a decently sized bow by modern standards. This is certainly plausible, especially if you don't have the length needed to make a bow from a single piece, but it does rely on the bow not falling apart from poor crafting and uneven torque. The upgraded bow is really fascinating. From the player's point of view, you can admire the engravings in the belly of the bow. However, if you look at the bow in the menu, and especially seeing it in the Ezila's hands, it's very clearly a visual replica of Asiatic bows. The long tips are referred to as siya in Arabic sources, and serve to provide extra leverage for shorter bows. This design far predates actual usage in real life. This is probably an implausible design in the game. In reality, Asiatic bows were composite bows, made from layering horn, wood and sinew. The all-wood design in Primal would probably not be that strong, and not necessitate the elongated tips. The longbow is certainly not a plausible design. It's tough to see what the bow is made from. If it's bone, the long length would simply snap. Bone is too inflexible and brittle to be suitable for the flexibility needed for a bow. If the bow is made from wood, it would need to be a very strong wood. Having a longer bow doesn't make it a more powerful bow, and bow length was mostly a matter of necessity. In reality, self-bows were typically made from a single piece of wood, and the length was required to get the maximum power without snapping. Shorter bows were often made from composite materials. The double bow might look like the most ridiculous fantasy design to the layperson, but it actually is based off a real design. These bows are commonly referred to as Penobscot bows, also known as double bows. The purpose is to provide extra strength by combining 2 separate bows and having them work together as compared to a single bow. The version in Primal is a bit more decorative with the split limb tips, but otherwise the bow should function. The double arrow thing has to be addressed though. While it is possible to shoot multiple arrows at once, the game does a good job of replicating the spread it would have in real life. However, what is overlooked is that the energy in the bow is divided between the arrows. Shooting 2 arrows at once means that they will only be half as effective. There are a couple of small nitpicks. The shooting animation, for some reason, keeps the arrow pinned against the bow rather than resting on the hand, which would have certainly been the only way to shoot without arrow rest. The bow limbs don't flex when fully drawn, so the bows look a little static from the player's perspective. The bows also contain some decorative blue stone at the tips. This is not good bow design. The tips have to be as light as possible, as adding weight will slow the bow and have a negative effect on performance. It would make more sense to have these decorations closer to the grip. A small positive is the shooting animation. The bow and hand seems to jump forward on release, and this is actually what happens in real life, though different styles of archery will control this differently. Overall, Far Cry Primal offers an interesting take on archery in a series that is otherwise known for its excellent gunplay. Fights are smooth and fast, controls are on point, and it makes you want to pick more fights just to get the satisfaction of drawing the bow and hitting another warrior in the head. The small nuances in control, visual and sound effects is pleasing for the player. If you haven't played Primal, you're not missing out on too much. It lacks the deep story and twist in the main Far Cry games, and its main appeal is in the prehistoric setting. If you like FPS games or open world games, especially of the Ubisoft variety, you'll like Far Cry Primal. As an archer, it was pretty fun running or riding around a colourful landscape to inflict primitive death on my foes. For me, this game does hit the mark. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Archery Popshots. This is NUSensei, and as always, shoot straight and aim for your best.